today's Capital Markets Day. I really appreciate the overwhelming sort of support and attendance and interest in the business from all of our shareholders and potentially new shareholders that are attending today's session. After that catchy little jingle about IR 4.0, the Industrial Revolution, we have put together, I think, a really good program of our really important companies that are new to the Tern investors, and that they have not presented before, and the exciting CEOs, the dynamic CEOs running those businesses. So you'll hear from them today as they are impacting the areas of IoT that have to deal with data, communications, and the idea of automation, as you saw in the video. So I think without further ado, I'd like to introduce Gareth Evans from Progressive Research, who will provide you all with an update and a view on the IoT market and give you some use examples of what's happening that we believe is dynamic opportunities for us to create value and deliver value to you all, our shareholders. So with that, Gareth, please introduce yourself and let's move on with the agenda.
Okay, as Al said, my name's Gareth Evans. I've been a technology research analyst for give or take 20 years, and I've been working with Tern as a client of Progressive Equity Research for the last 2 or so years. So it's a real pleasure to be invited back to speak at this Capital Markets Day. This is actually the second CMD at which Tern have asked me to speak. The first one was just under a couple of years ago, and that was face-to-face, so with live investors in a real room. So that was a real pleasure. And it's great to be speaking to you again, albeit remotely, and hopefully one of these years we'll get back to a more normal setting where we can see each other face to face and have a more proper conversation. But Al and Sarah have asked me today to provide a high-level overview or a run-through of IoT, what it's about, and a number of pretty interesting areas. And so I thought I'd start off the presentation just by giving a quick overview of what I'm planning to say, really talking through the IoT at the highest level, a bit of a definition and a market overview, then talking about a couple of comments that we've heard from some of the biggest players in the industry at an event where Al presented a couple of weeks back, then narrowing it right down to some very specific end-user use cases, using a couple of Tern's investees as examples for that part of the presentation, and then finishing up talking about Tern itself, how it operates, how it's a bit different, and in particular what we've seen over recent quarters and what we'd expect over the coming weeks and months. So that's the agenda for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. I thought I'd start with the definitions, traditional in these sorts of events to do that. If you look on the internet, you'll find a very large number of different definitions of the Internet of Things, or IoT. In fact, there were so many different definitions, I thought there was no particular harm in adding one more. So I've come up with my own. You'll see it here. I think the Internet of Things is really about a number of connected devices working together for an organization to achieve some kind of goal or deliver some kind of task. Normally, that involves a potentially large number of in-field or on-site devices gathering and harvesting data, bringing data together, and that's then collated and drawn away to generally some kind of central or cloud-based platform where that information is stored, is analyzed, and actions or decisions are taken based on that data, and those decisions then sometimes are acted on separately, and sometimes those actions percolate back through the Internet of Things into the real world, and real life things change because of the IoT activity. So that's what I think the IoT is all about. Key questions clearly relate to the scale of that market, how much there is, and also the scope for growth, how much opportunity there is for that market to grow. There are a number of several billion devices, depending on how you define it. There are several billion devices already connected. Each person's smartphone around the world is the most obvious or ubiquitous device. But in addition to that, there are billions and billions of other much smaller devices, microcontrollers or processors or sensors, all of which can or should be connected into this great web of Internet of Things to derive value or deliver value for shareholders or organizations or individuals as we go about living our daily lives. That growth or that existing scale will be driven in terms of growth by a number of factors, most notably Moore's law and the ongoing improvement and acceleration of processing power as time goes by, and in particular, the reduction in pricing. A lot of these components are shared with, they're common to consumer telephony, telecoms products or radio chips. So those prices are coming down and down as those markets grow and grow, and that will help the IoT growth and the expansion of the addressable market. And connectivity itself is getting cheaper. The price of moving a piece of data from A to B is coming down dramatically. The 5G networks will make that even faster and easier to achieve, and at lower and lower prices as time goes on. So there's some really, really good drivers for this Internet of Things market. A couple of specific areas within the IoT market, which I think are particularly exciting areas. The industrial side, they call it the industrial Internet of Things, mainly around factories or process plant machinery, either in one large location or spread disparately across the world or across the country. And then the medical things, IOMT, the Internet of Medical Things to do with healthcare. Both of those, although the acronyms are built differently in a slightly confusing way, there are a couple of things that they share in terms of the importance of data and the large amounts of data which need to be sent back and forth either across a factory setting or an industrial platform or medical patient data, super high levels of significantly heavy information-rich data flying around the internet. But the other aspect is security. If you've got that level of data with those important things, you've got to be very, very sure that that's securely managed. And that'll be a theme which I'll talk about 2 or 3 times as we go through this deck, because security is increasingly important within the IoT landscape. So, as I said, the next thing we're going to do is talk about the perspective of a couple of very large businesses. Al gave a presentation 3 or 4 weeks ago at a Liberum investment bank investment event with professional investors. There are about 60 individuals, I think, from 30 or so different institutions on that call, on that presentation, and I was alongside a couple of the absolute industry heavyweights. Infineon Technologies, 40 billion euro market cap business, heavily involved in the automotive space, but with an increasing presence in IoT, and also Imagination Technologies. It was previously active in the UK stock market, now in private hands, but it's again a significant business with a very, very strong position in the global market for GPUs, graphic processing units. And they also have a strong position in IoT. So it was great to get some comments from those significant players and to see Al describe the Tern proposition alongside those. And even better, it gives me the opportunity to shamelessly steal some of their slides and use some of the stats that they gave literally a couple of weeks ago. So these are very much up to the minute numbers. And the key question is, how big is this IoT market space? Infineon, describing their own view of the market, what they call the serviceable addressable market, gave this slide. 2 important things. It's already, give or take, 9 billion euros in scale, so it's a very significant market. And secondly, it's growing at about 10% compound annual growth over the next 5 years. So it's a very reassuring, solid level, strong position to start from, with a good level of ongoing growth from a very large, well-respected and credible source. I think that gives a good level of reassurance about the IoT space, its scale and its growth. The next slide I quite like is from Imagination. I thought this was useful because it shows over here on the left-hand side, you've got these devices, these small, perhaps not super intelligent devices, sensors, not capable of doing too much locally. You might get a little bit of local data analytics there, but most of the heavy lifting is done in the cloud over here on the right. So you see on the right-hand side, that's where the cloud storage is going on, that's where the analytics is taking place. The key problem is, in between those two things, you've got the public internet. And that's the real issue, because for information to flow from left to right, from the devices into the cloud, it's got into a private cloud at the far end. It's got to go across the public internet in many situations, and vice versa. If your analytics drive some activity that you want to take place or to push forward, and you want that to happen through your IoT devices in the real world, again, you've got to go back through the public internet for that to happen. And that leads to a huge reliance on something they call trust. And that's what this next slide is about, because this is again from Imagination Technologies. Their presenter Mark Cannell described this, and this is the key thing for the IoT, as far as Mark was concerned, was all about trust. And you can see here, it starts with trust of the device. You need to know, if you're transmitting information to and from across the public internet, you need to be sure that the device you think you're communicating with is the real device you think you're communicating with. You can't have any lack of security. But once you trust that device, you can start to trust the data, the information that comes from it or comes through the web to you from that device. That allows you to build some information patterns, put in a large amount of data from multiple devices, and that means you can then derive proper insights and decide actions that you want to take. And then you can fulfill those actions in some cases by pushing information or commands or instructions back through the Internet of Things to the devices out in the field to make things happen, to change the speed of an engine or change the temperature of some kind of device or some product or some situation. You can make a real world change because of that. And all of that relies very heavily on trust and security, or certainty of trust across that chain. So I felt those were a few of the key things that, to my mind, came out of that event and were very useful for me in understanding some of the big drivers. It was interesting to see, even at the very, very top of the internet, of the IoT food chain, these largest players, they're still talking about device scalability and about trust, which is very interesting to see. After many years of IoT evolution and growth, there's still an absolute requirement or focus on those things. Now I'm going to take a quick sort of move to the other end of the telescope and look at it from very much from an end user perspective, looking at a couple of Tern's investee companies. And you're going to hear it, as Al said, you're going to hear soon directly from some of the management teams of those businesses from whom I think you haven't heard before as investors. So hopefully that'll be useful. And I'll just quickly run through a couple of end market use cases in case that's helpful. First one is Wild Networks. So we'll talk to you about that. They run a business which provides a large number of different styles of network, including mesh networking, where you can bring lots of devices together in a difficult setting or where there's not much other connectivity. And this example is an agriculture technology business. They're growing, I think it's strawberries, and you can see down the bottom right-hand side, the sensor there is monitoring. It'll be monitoring things like the moisture in the soil, or the temperature, or the level of nutrients that these plants are receiving. And then that information goes up through the cloud into some kind of analytics platform, brought together with information perhaps around weather forecasting, which might be managed centrally, or demand profile. And you can even imagine a situation where this strawberry grower, if there's a sudden glut of strawberries, they want to slow down the strawberries. Normally everyone thinks about trying to rush things to market, but if the market is flooded with product, you might actually want to slow down the growth of these agricultural products to allow them to arrive later when you might get a better price. So there's lots of things that you can do in the cloud that then you feed back into the field to make things change. That's just one real-life example of IoT in action. Another one relates to healthcare. This is Fundamental VR, who have a fantastic way of generating a representation of a real-life surgical setting. This is a surgeon going through a mock-up, a virtual reality representation of a surgical procedure and some newly developed medical device. And surgeons need to learn how these things work. It's often an unsaid thing. You don't want to hear about how surgeons learn, how they practice these surgical techniques that they undertake on us day in, day out. They need to have a place to practice, a place to learn. Often that's done on dead bodies, on cadavers, but they're in short supply. And the difficulty is getting the surgeon to the cadaver at the right time with the right medical instrument, right medical device. It's very difficult to arrange. So Fundamental has a great platform for allowing this to happen. They build what they call a virtual operating room, which allows one operator even literally to whisper in the ear of the surgeon as he or she is undertaking this procedure, so they can learn together, they can develop their best practice and make sure that by the time they're operating on real patients, the surgeon is really, really well trained and capable of carrying out that task. The final example is a sad one. It's depressing. It's a very significant breach of security. It's also in the healthcare space by coincidence, but this is about where things have gone wrong. This was a German case late last year. There was a patient in a German hospital. That hospital was subject to a cyber attack, and that meant that the hospital was unable to deliver the care. The devices they needed to use to deliver care to that patient were not available. The patient had to be moved elsewhere to a different hospital, and they very sadly died. So I think that really brings it home that security needs to be improved. It needs to be improved significantly, and that needs to happen now, and it's not being done. So there's a lot that can be achieved, or should be achieved, and the industry has clearly got a long way to go to get that right. So then just to finish off, a couple of comments on Tern in particular, how it operates, and the way that it perhaps is different from some of the other investment opportunities out there. I think Tern is very focused on the way they invest. It's the how, the when, and the where of those investment decisions. A lot of it's driven by digital transformation. Clearly, COVID-19 is leading to a lot of opportunities around that as businesses accelerate their transformation processes, and Tern, I believe, is standing ready to try and deliver on those. once the investments are made, it's all about helping and nurturing the businesses. I understand Tern runs a weekly or fortnightly call across its investee companies to help them share best practices, bounce ideas off each other, potentially work together or collaborate on things, but at least talk to each other and describe the way that things have been achieved and what they've been able to do in their own industries. And hopefully there's value of that across the network, and I'm sure that the companies will talk about that later on, but definitely that's part of what Tern offers. And then finally, patience and experience in managing exits or additional investment rounds. Al and Sarah and their team have a lot of experience of this. A lot of the management teams maybe are going through this for the first time, so it's great to see Tern able to offer those sorts of things to the businesses. And then I think it's only right to acknowledge that there will be some challenges in this space where Tern has to deal with a number of investee companies who would love the additional limelight and focus that Tern can offer, but they've got end customers who are very sensitive about divulging too much detail, too much information, because those customers, they feel that they're getting market advantage, they're doing better in their own market by using IoT in a clever way, and they don't want to give away that advantage. So there's an inherent tension there which Tern has to deal with. The other tension is to do with the frequency of news flow. Tern doesn't have a large number of investees. It's a relatively small group with not all that many investees, so it makes it very difficult for them to feed a hungry group of investors always looking for an RNS. I'd love to see an RNS, 1 or 2 or 3 a week. People would love to see, but Tern has to manage that pressure and deal with the fact that they've got a relatively small number of investees who don't have the capacity and certainly haven't got the ability to deal with a very high level of news flow. So they're treading a fine line on both of those two metrics.
Yes, Sweet Pea.
With a final comment about the group, it's unusual for a business of this size, really, to have gone out during last year and made a couple of quite clear commitments about the fact they expected to have a new investment and a follow-on round or syndication by the end of Q1 of 2021. They said that, and then they've delivered on it. So Talking Medicines, who I know you're going to hear from later on this afternoon, was a new investment they made in late 2020, and Wild Networks had a significant valuation uplift in early 2021. So it's great to see the management of Tern committing to these things and then delivering on that promise in very short order. I think more generally, it's good to see the way that they're bringing both strategic and financial investors to these follow-on rounds. They have financial investors into Wild, and you've had other people downing into the fundamental VR round. And fundamental VR, the previous round also included Mayo Clinic and a German business, Sana Kliniken, which are very significant strategic investors for a business involved in those sorts of activities. So I think a lot of things going on. But in my opinion, there's a very, very strong flow in terms of what Tern's doing. In terms of what we can expect coming forward, I don't know anything more than you, sadly. Clearly, looking in the annual report, Tern have a strong focus on third-party investments and liquidity events. So hopefully over the coming weeks and months, those are the sorts of things that we can expect to see. But for now, I hope that's been a useful summary of the